Hey guys, it's Libby coming to you today from my dad's office because he is still asleep and this is the room that is farthest away from his bedroom. So hopefully I will not disturb him down here. Because there's going to be a lot of words that are about to happen because it's a Measure for Measure Day on the Bard Book Club. This video may not be longer than the average BBC video, but it is going to be denser, so I will not do a lot of preamble. Let's just start talking about the book. This is one of Shakespeare's most religious plays, if not his definitively most religious play. The title is a reference to the book of Matthew. Gospel of Matthew? Is there a difference? I don't know. Which makes it an interesting choice for this atheist as a favorite Shakespeare play, but there it is. So I thought a lot, very much. You can see all of my sticky notes about how to approach this video, and I've decided to go for what many people would consider the least logical order. So I'm going to start discussing the most allegorical reading of this play, which is only relevant to the last scene of this play, or mostly relevant to the last scene of this play. I think normally people would say either start at the beginning and work towards the end, or start at the most concrete and work towards the most abstract, but the most allegorical reading is the one that really made me fall in love with this play, and it's the first thing that I sort of figured out about it. So it's sort of the first way in which I think about it, even if it's not that logical to other people's minds. So zip your mind forward to the very last scene of the play. The Duke has come back to Vienna out of disguise. He's greeting Angelo, Isabella, and then Friar Peter and Mariana challenge Angelo. We discover or we already think that Claudius is dead. Isabella then discovers that Claudius is not dead, but not before joining Mariana in asking the Duke to pardon Angelo. And so the way I'm going to approach it now is what I call the soteriological reading. Soteriology is the study of the mechanics of salvation, generally the Christian study of the mechanics of Christian salvation. And what's really interesting about this scene is that it presents a vision of Catholic soteriology. Shakespeare's religion is one of the many things that we don't know about Shakespeare. Obviously, he was living in a largely Anglican England, so statistically it would make sense if he was Anglican. There is some evidence to suggest that his father, John, was maybe secretly Catholic, which could also imply that Shakespeare himself was maybe secretly Catholic. I honestly think that this reading of this play provides better evidence for Shakespeare's Catholicism than any information we have in his biography. But I'm still not saying Shakespeare was definitely a Catholic. You can certainly represent something allegorically, even if you think it is fictional. So what we've got here is Angelo, who I think we can all agree is a sinner. He hath done some bad things, although actually we'll talk about people who maybe think he didn't actually do some bad things because he didn't actually do the things. So Angelo, however uncomfortable it may make you, is us in this scenario. We are people who, by our nature, do wrong. And what Angelo needs is to be pardoned by the Duke, because the Duke has the authority. So the Duke in this allegory is God. However, the Duke, like the God of Catholicism, is inaccessible. You can't just directly ask him to forgive you because his responsibility is to mete out justice, which is in conflict with mercy. So Angelo isn't able to petition, and in fact Angelo doesn't want to petition at this point. Angelo just wants to be dead. But Mariana is able to petition the Duke, and it is not a coincidence that Mariana is such a similar name to Mary, the Virgin Mary. She's here representing the saints. Mariana herself, though, is not able to successfully petition the Duke. He doesn't listen to her. So Mariana needs to go in another direction, loop in Isabella, which means in this case Isabella is Jesus. I think it's very interesting that Shakespeare chose to put his Jesus character in the form of a woman here. And this is sort of the way things work in Catholic soteriology and forgiveness theory. So God is inaccessible. Jesus is actually also pretty inaccessible, and the people who are accessible are the saints. They are accessible to us mere mortals. So we need to get the saints on our side so that the saints can petition Jesus, so that Jesus can do the forgiving, because like Jesus and God are kind of the same thing, which is weird and complicated. And so when the Duke sees that Isabella, who has been most wronged by Angelo, is able to show mercy towards him, that inspires the Duke to show mercy towards Angelo. And this is how it works with us and God, so saith the Pope. And I think the soteriological interpretation may help people who are really unsatisfied with the state of the marriages at the end of the play. I do not blame you if you have problems with the Angelo-Mariana relationship and like, why is she still in love with him when he's just objectively horrible? Well, the answer is, if she's not an actual person, but the Virgin Mary will still love you no matter how objectively horrible you are. And then if we are interpreting Isabella and the Duke as getting married, which we do not have to do, then what you have is Jesus returning to God. So this is the end of the play, is sort of the resurrection, or at least the marriage that happens post the play is the resurrection and the reforming of Jesus and God into one being, because the notion of man and wife as one flesh has some rhyme with the notion of the Trinity being like separate but one. And the reason that I found this interpretation so compelling is because of what Angelo represents in relation to Shakespeare himself, not in a soteriological allegory, but as a social representation. So let's take a look at this play from a socio-historical angle. I told you this was going to be a dense video. So all of these characters are sort of representing the social classes, social archetypes of Shakespeare's time. I'm kind of hesitant to call these characters archetypes because they feel like a lot more real than the average Shakespearean character. I said this is my favorite Shakespeare play. My second favorite is Richard II, which I love for its beautiful poetry. I don't think anyone reads Richard II and goes, "It me," but I cannot help when I'm reading Measure for Measure, but constantly go, "It me! It me!" So although it is no longer clear to a modern audience, a 17th century audience would easily have read Angelo as a Puritan. There's a lot of coding of him making him a Puritan, although obviously since this is set in Vienna, that's a Catholic region, everyone's technically Catholic, but he's coded as Protestant in here. The way we get that is that the Duke calls him precise, and Puritans were also called precisians, so that's a reference there. And also Puritans were considered to be social climbers, and we see that Angelo rejected his fiancée because it turns out she wasn't going to have as much money as he thought she was going to have, and so that's not good for his career, that's not good for his finances. He needs to find somebody else. And also I think the largely Anglican audience would rather enjoy seeing a Puritan being portrayed as hypocritical. Now, I think the modern conception of the Puritan is largely as anti-fun, which is not exactly correct. Puritans were okay with people having fun. Oliver Cromwell himself was said to enjoy dancing rather a bit, but they did not like the arts. They were anti the arts. This is not something that I know a whole lot about, but something about art requiring more like intellectual endeavor, which should be spent, on the Bible. And also the arts are considered more lewd because they are about a sort of public presentation, as opposed to fun, which is a more like personal experience. And having positive personal experiences is a fine thing for Puritans, but sort of this public-facing thing is not something that they were about. So the Puritans were quite anti-theater. I think it's safe to say that not many Puritans went to see this play. And of course, about 50 years after Shakespeare died, the Puritans gain power and they shut down all of the theaters as basically one of the first things that they do, because none of that. And so the Puritans are the force in early modern English society that are most threatening to Shakespeare's livelihood, to his pocket, and also to, something that I think he valued. We don't really know how Shakespeare felt about his plays, but I find it hard to believe that he just really didn't care and was only writing these to make rent. I think he liked them at least a little bit. And so the fact that Shakespeare presumably has all of this rage built up against them, and which he does express by creating this horrible Puritan-coded character, and yet he's like, but at the end, you still forgive them. So it's like he's saying, okay, Puritans, I don't like you, I know you do bad things, but I forgive you for the harm that you have done to me. And I think that's a very nice thing for a playwright to do. Okay, now let's talk about some particular characters. I'm going to start with the Duke, because he's probably the most controversial. No, I said that and then I realized that is wrong. Everybody in this play is very controversial, at least the Duke, Angelo, and Isabella. Many people have had many contrasting thoughts and opinions on these people. So I, for the longest time, kind of liked the Duke, and when I started reading other people's opinions on this play, I was really surprised at how much vehemence I found regarding him. People are really disgusted by his actions, and for a while I was just like, I don't get it. What's so wrong with him? And I realized that I had only been reading him allegorically. I was not reading him like a real person. I was reading him as, this representation of God, as a representation of Jesus, as a representation of King James I, King James VI to all my Scottish viewers, or as a representation of a playwright. So let's take a bit of a look at these different allegorical interpretations. I'll start with two that I will just briefly mention because I'm not really qualified to talk about them. The first is the Duke as James I. So this, we think, was Shakespeare's first Jacobean play, coming out in 1603, which is when Elizabeth died and James became King of England. This is quite an interesting transition because James had already been a king in Scotland, so we have a king who we kind of already know what he's like as a king based on what he's done before, which is a rare event in monarchy. And a lot of people have pointed out similarities between the sorts of things that the Duke does and the sorts of things that King James does, the sort of re-entry into the city, and being greeted and having power handed back to him by temporary deputies, his approach to law, and his interest in sort of being behind the scenes and controlling. A lot of people have seen these connections. And if this was a reading that Shakespeare wanted his readers to see, then the setting makes a lot more sense. So Vienna is a very unusual setting for Shakespeare. Shakespeare, most of his plays are set in the Mediterranean, in the British Isles, or in parts of France that England is currently saying should be part of the British Isles. The exceptions, there's partial exceptions with Winter's Tale, which is set partially in Bohemia in Central Europe, and a couple of scenes in All's Well That Ends Well, which are set in Paris, which, in that play is not currently being claimed by the English. And then the only play that Shakespeare wrote, other than Measure for Measure, that's set entirely outside of the Mediterranean and British Isles and France, is Hamlet. And you will see, that's not the only connection between these two plays. They were written fairly close together. So, Vienna as a setting is kind of notable. It would probably seem less exotic to his audience than the Mediterranean. The climate is more similar, which Jacobeans would interpret as the temperaments being more similar. They're both sort of major European cities which are set on a river, but not on a coast. And so there's many elements of Shakespeare's London that we can recognize in Vienna, but it is still distinctly different, which means it's easier to make social commentary about your own country if you set it in a different country. This happened with Beaumarchais in 18th century France with his Figaro plays, two of which were later turned into operas, which became more famous than his Figaro plays, which are about the issues with abuse by the aristocracy. He originally wrote those plays set in France, but the French censors said he can't do this. And so he changed the setting to Spain to say, like, look, these are problems with Spain, which have absolutely nothing to do with problems over here. So Shakespeare's choice of setting grants him plausible deniability if he wants to criticize the current monarch. So that's the Duke as James I. There's also the Duke as Jesus. Earlier I talked about Isabella representing Jesus, and just because there are multiple and contradictory readings of a text doesn't mean that, like, only one of them can be right. It's okay for contradictions to exist in interpretations, and they all sort of layer on top of each other, and you don't need to construct one grand theory of the play or of any text and say, like, this is the specific thing that it's saying and all of these things represent all of these other things. Lots of things can be representing lots of things in different contexts. So the reading of the Duke as Jesus sort of ties into the reading of the Duke as God, in that when he is in the first scene before he hands over power to Angelo, then he is God in his unembodied celestial form, and when he disguises himself as the friar, that's when he becomes Jesus, who is the embodied form of God. And we saw that God is inaccessible, and so the Duke had been inaccessible before to the people of Vienna, and then when he disguises himself, he sort of enters and walks among them, and he also, like Jesus, is ridiculed and spat upon by Lucio, specifically. Although, interestingly, while Jesus does forgive the people who tormented him, the Duke does not seem very interested in pardoning Lucio. So that's all I have for that one. If you know more about the life of Jesus and see more connections, I'm totally happy to hear about them. This is why YouTube has a comments box. So now moving on to interpretations that I feel slightly more comfortable with, we've got the Duke as God. And if I was writing this out, I would write the Duke as parenthesis failed parenthesis God, because we see in some ways the Duke is acting exactly like God, and in some ways he is trying to act like God, but things go wrong. Now, one of the problems we have in interpreting this play is the Duke's motivations are not fully clear to us, particularly with his first action, creating Angelo as his deputy. We don't really know why he picked Angelo. It could be that he actually thinks Angelo is the best person for the job because of his reputation for being, I don't know, rectitudinous. Or it could be that he has designed this as a test for Angelo. The way that he talks indicates the first option, but that's complicated by the fact that he already knows about a bad thing Angelo has done. The Duke knows about the jilting of Mariana. Not a lot of other people seem to know about this, so is presumably hush-hush, but the Duke has this godlike omniscience. And so he already knows about that. So he knows that Angelo is not worthy of the reputation that he has. And also he stays in Vienna to see what's going on, possibly to keep an eye on people in general, but also possibly to keep an eye specifically on Angelo. And this is a very godlike thing to do. God likes to test people. Abraham, Job, Jephthah, everybody. He also clearly has this plan for how everything is going to work out, whether it's something he developed before the play begins or once it becomes clear what Angelo is actually like. He has this whole plot for how we will get Angelo, and there's all of these moving pieces, and there's actually sort of two separate plots, the head trick and the bed trick, the switching of Claudio with somebody else's head and the switching of Isabella and Mariana. And then at the end, he wants this big denouement in which Angelo, who he knows to be terrible, will be revealed to be terrible, and this deed will have more strength than if he had just said it himself. But things keep not quite going the way he wants them to. And this is the interpretation of the Duke as failed God, because he is not actually God, he just wants to be, and since he, does not have this, ultimate authority over the universe, he will necessarily fail in his godlike pursuits. So Lucio is definitely not someone that he bargained for. In the last scene, he's sort of trying to make everything fall out exactly as he has planned, with the accusation first by Isabella and then by Friar Peter and Mariana. But Lucio keeps popping in and making these jokes about how, Mariana, she's not a maid, she's not a wife, and she's not a widow. What does that mean? I know. And the Duke is always like, dude, just shut up, you're ruining the plan. And you also have the issue with Barnadine, the prisoner who does not want to be executed. He appears only in one scene, but he's great. So he says, you know, I'm drunk, I'm not fit to die and go to heaven, and you can't kill me when you know I'm going to go to hell. That would be immoral, so I guess you can't kill me today. I'm not really interested in dying right now. And the Duke is like, no, we really need you to die, otherwise my plan will not work. So he thinks he can control all of these people, but he can in fact not. And interestingly, even though the Duke encounters all of these problems, everything still does work out, which implies that there is a god. He's just still in his heaven and not in Vienna. And the actual god is making sure that things all work out. So when Barnadine refuses to be killed, it turns out there is another prisoner who had already died, and he actually looks a lot more like Claudio than Barnadine did. So as it turns out, he's actually a better head option to send to Angelo. And when the Duke hears about this, he says, oh, 'tis an accident that heaven provides, meaning that God, who admittedly is not me, is going to make this work out. And then this reading of the Duke as failed god is related to the reading of Duke as playwright or stage manager, parenthesis, incompetent playwright or stage manager, one who cannot actually manage the production. So again, I want to take a look at Lucio interrupting in that last scene, and the language that he and the Duke use are specifically theatrical language. When Lucio is interrupting Isabella, the Duke tells him, I wish you now then, pray you take note of it, and when you have a business for yourself, pray heaven you then be perfect. Taking note, when actors are told, you know, this is the way you should read this line, or this is the sort of action you should perform, they would write a note. And then the phrase be perfect is when you see used regarding actors and their lines and knowing their lines exactly. Hamlet, ding ding ding, there's a connection. Hamlet tells the players in The Murder of Gonzago to be perfect, because that play is very important to Hamlet, as this play, which is not really a play, is very important to the Duke. So that's all I've got for that guy. We're going to stick with Lucio for a bit now. Lucio is a very interesting character. It sort of seems like he and Angelo put together would make the classic Shakespearean villain, but in this instance they are separated. So looking at the structure of the play, in the structure of the typical Shakespearean play, the first scene, or at least the first half of the first scene, is small, intimate, private, and then you get the public scene. Obviously, King Lear is like this. You first have a quiet conversation between Kent and Gloucester, and then you get this really big pageantry performative scene with Lear and his daughters. In Measure for Measure, our first scene, our private scene, is just between the Duke, Aeschylus, there's a couple of other lords on stage, but they don't get lines, and Angelo. And we're hearing about a transition of power. So you might expect in the next scene that this new type of power will be shown to us. We will see Angelo receiving some sort of honors as he's going to serve as deputy, or, you know, starting to do his new Duke-like duties. But the next thing we get is with Lucio and two other characters that we never see again. And so we are now presumably out in the street. So we are in this public space as opposed to the private space we'd had before. And I think this is really interesting because, like in King Lear, the public scene is highly performative. Here we're seeing an everyday conversation that people like Shakespeare's audience might have had in the street, and it sort of makes you think, to what extent is this also a performance? More about performance when we get to Hamlet, guys. Hamlet is all over this play. And in Act 1, Scene 2, we actually do get to see Angelo's power, but we get to see it indirectly. So we get to hear this conversation between Mistress Overdone and Pompey, where they say, "What, is there a maid with child by him? No, but there's a woman with maid by him. You have not heard the proclamation, have you? What proclamation, man? All houses in the suburbs of Vienna," which means brothels, "must be plucked down. And what shall become of those in the city? They shall stand for seed. They had gone down too, but a wise burgher put in for them." And then a couple lines later, we see the entrance of Claudio and Juliet in chains going to prison. So Angelo's proclamation that the laws against fornication are now going to be enforced, that is not seen. Instead, we get the effects of that proclamation. And I'd also like to draw your attention to a line earlier in that scene from Mistress Overdone. She says, "Thus, what with the war, what with the sweat, what with the gallows, and what with poverty, I am custom shrunk," which means all of these bad things are happening, which are making men either dead or poor, which means I'm not making any money because I need men to pay to have sex with my girls. And that line is really emblematic of this scene as a city comedy, because we have these general problems: war, poverty, gallows, which is people being punished for crimes. And these are these, broad social and political problems, and they're being focused down into Mistress Overdone's problems, which are economic. Because of all of these bad things in the world, this is affecting me, this is affecting my bottom line. If you want to know more about city comedies, I discussed it at length in my video called Shakespeare and Genre. I'm also going to talk more about city comedy when we get to Troilus and Cressida, because in that one I have to actually make a case for why it is a city comedy, but I feel like if you just know what city comedy is, everything else when you read this play should sort of be self-evident. So anyway, back to Lucio in this scene, and we see him being very witty, very clever, very brilliant, saying, "Behold, behold, where Mistress Mitigation comes." He's able to come up with this sort of moniker for Mistress Overdone. He and his friends are making puns on money and on venereal disease. And Lucio, he may be a massive dick, but he's kind of fun to listen to. You kind of enjoy hearing him talk, which makes him similar to classic Shakespearean villains like Richard III and Iago in Othello, who are both people who do horrible things, directly causing or inciting murder, and then also have this really clever wordplay thing. In Measure for Measure, those two roles are separated. So Lucio doesn't really do any big horrible things. He just has the wittiness and charisma, and then Angelo is not nearly as charismatic, but he is the one who does the big bad things. And that makes Angelo self-aware in a way that is different to the classic Shakespearean villain, in a way that I think makes it easier to relate to him, although that is a difficult feeling to experience. So Richard III, Aaron the Moor from Titus Andronicus, and Iago are all aware that they are villains, and they delight in this. Angelo, at first he isn't aware that he's a villain, but we see him become aware and be repulsed by this. He does not delight in his villainy, he hates it. And so I want to read to you a speech that he gives at the end of Act 4. This is Act 4, Scene 4. Act 4, Scenes 5 and 6 are both very short, and then we move into Act 5, which is only one scene with the whole big denouement. So he says, Aeschylus has just exited the stage, and Angelo has confirmed that he wants Claudio to be executed. And this is before he goes and has sex with Mariana. This is presumably about to happen. "This deed unshapes me quite, makes me unpregnant and dull to all proceedings, a deflowered maid, and by an eminent body that enforced the law against it, but that her tender shame will not proclaim against her maiden loss, how might she tongue me? Yet reason dares her no, for my authority bears off a credent bulk that no particular scandal once can touch, but it confounds the breather. He should have lived, save that his riotous youth with dangerous sense might in the times to come have ta'en revenge by so receiving a dishonored life with ransom of such shame. Would yet he had lived. Alack, when once our grace we have forgot, nothing goes right. We would and we would not." several things to note about this soliloquy. First off, what really drew my attention to it was the word unpregnant, which is a very strange word, especially when being used by a man. It's not quite as strange in the early modern period as now, because pregnant pretty much now only means being filled with baby, but back then it meant just sort of generally being filled with something. It could, generally something abstract like motivation or desire, and also baby. And this word unpregnant appears only one other time in the Shakespeare corpus. Give you 3 guesses as to what play it's in. Hamlet. And then there's 2 structure things that show us the turmoil that Angelo is in. First, you have sentences ending in the middle of a line instead of at the end of the line, which sort of forces you to throw off the meter. And I've seen different texts with some of which occasionally add a word, but speaking generally, if you count out the meter in this speech, you'll notice that all of the lines where Angelo is talking about himself, so this deed unshapes me quite, makes me unpregnant and dull to all proceedings, those lines have what is called a feminine ending, which is where you have the iambic pentameter but then an unstressed syllable at the end of the line, which makes you sound like you're asking a question and makes you sound unsure. So when he's talking about himself, he's unsure. And then the lines about Isabella and Claudio, who he does not hi, Dad.
It's okay.
Okay. And then the lines about Isabella and Claudio, who he does not directly name, but who are clearly the people that he's referring to, those lines do not have feminine endings. They have confident endings. So he knows what they're going to do. He's just not sure about what he's going to do. And then I would like to talk about the diction in here as well, but first I think it's time to talk a little bit about Isabella. Potentially the protagonist of this play. I think she reads differently to modern viewers than she would have to a Shakespearean audience. I remember when I first saw this, my reaction, and from what I could judge of the reaction of people around me, was that Isabella is the main character. She is admirable. She is the one with whom you are not necessarily supposed to identify with, but who you should aspire to be. That is not how a Shakespearean audience would have received her, because Isabella is Catholic. Now, obviously, since this is set in Vienna, technically everybody is Catholic, but Isabella is the one who is performing Catholicism because she is a nun. Protestants don't have nuns. And if you need a brief refresh on the religious history of England, it has been kind of a mess in the past couple decades after the death of Henry VIII, who converted who converted England to Anglicanism. Mainly for political reasons as opposed to for religious reasons. You get his son, Edward VI, who is vehemently Protestant. He dies young, big swing over to Mary, who is vehemently Catholic, and then afterwards you get Elizabeth, who is Protestant. She restores Anglicanism to be the state church of England, but she said she would not pry into men's souls. So, unlike her siblings, she's not going to beat down your door and search your belongings to see if you have a Latin Bible or a Book of Common Prayer and then throw you in jail if you have the wrong type of book. So Elizabeth is officially Protestant, and you were expected to perform Protestantism, but if you were Catholic, that is, you didn't have to be in perpetual fear for your life. So regardless of Shakespeare's personal religious thoughts, which, as I've said, are not 100% clear, he had to be producing a play for an audience that was going to be largely Anglican, and if it was not, it would want to look like it was. So Isabella, not only a Catholic, but a nun, and a nun of a very strict order. The Sisters of St Clare was a begging order of nuns. They lived in extreme poverty, and as Francisca, this other nun, tells Isabella, there's very strict rules about interaction with men. You can only talk to him if you are in the presence of the Mother Abbess, and if you talk to him, your face has to be covered. If a man sees your face, it's not okay for him to hear your voice. This is strict even by nun standards, and it's not even strict enough for Isabella. her first line is, "And have you nuns no farther privileges?" Francisca says, "Are not these large enough?" And Isabella says, "Yes, truly, I speak not as desiring more, but rather wishing a more strict restraint upon the sisterhood, the votarists of St Clare." So now that I've introduced her in that light, we can look at her and Angelo, their philosophies, and their diction. So these two are fundamentalists, and they are the only fundamentalists on stage, but their fundamentalism is going in different directions. Isabella, Catholic; Angelo, puritanical. Isabella, like Queen Mary; Angelo, like King Edward. Obviously, what we want is the happy medium that was provided to us by Elizabeth. This is not relevant now, but it is relevant potentially in other readings, and that is that Isabella and Elizabeth are the same name. They both come from the Hebrew Elish Shiva, which means my God is an abundance, or my God is an oath, relevant name for her. And so Isabella is sort of connected to Queen Elizabeth in that they are both women who refuse men. Isabella by going into a convent, and Elizabeth by not marrying. And interestingly, the two most fundamentalist characters in the play also have the most sexual language of the play. Their language is more sexual than Lucio's, who is frequently visiting prostitutes, than Mistress Overdone, who is a bawd, than Juliet and Claudio, who have clearly done the deed. These two virgins have language that is dripping with innuendo. So in Angelo's soliloquy that I just read, you've got, "This deed unshapes me quite, makes me unpregnant and dull to all proceedings." Unshape, unpregnant, dull, all references to impotence. He calls himself an eminent body. He has a difficult time referring to people by name in the soliloquy, but he calls himself an eminent body, focusing on his physicality. She says, "How might she tongue me?" Tongue literally meaning speak against, but also, of course, using one's tongue against someone in other ways. And interestingly, all of this language is creating a picture of Angelo who is restrained and incapable and being acted upon, which is also how Isabella speaks. She desires restraint. She says to Angelo when he propositions her, "As much for my poor brother as myself, that is, were I under the terms of death, the impression of keen whips I'd wear as rubies, and strip myself to death as to a bed that longing have been sick for, ere I'll yield my body up to shame." And at this point, I have to remind you that kink is not a modern invention. Shakespearean readers would have seen the BDSM elements in their speeches, and they probably would have found it funny that these two people with whom they have religious disagreements are hypocritical. Angelo and Isabella are both incredibly sexually repressed. Practically everybody else on stage has had sex. And for Angelo, this repression results in an eruption of lust suddenly. For Isabella, it seems like this repression actually manifests in putting more restraint on herself. So she may actually be getting sexual gratification from this life that she is transitioning into in the convent. And so this repression of sexuality is also an expression of sexuality. You feel me? And then going back to Angelo's soliloquy that we've been reading, it's interesting that this is the last time we see him before he goes and has sex with Mariana. And this is a really interesting speech to give him before that happens, because it's a speech of impotence. And so when I first saw this, what I was kind of expecting was that he wouldn't be able to do it. He feels so terrible about raping this woman that it seems like he's not actually going to be able to perform. And so I was kind of half expecting in the last scene that everything's going to be foiled because he doesn't actually have sex with her. You could construct a conspiracy theory in which that does not actually happen, and either Mariana has lied to the Duke and Isabella, or Mariana has told the Duke and Isabella, but they're lying anyway, and then Angelo is for some reason going along with this. Not supported by the text, but if it helps you, run with it. And I've seen this play on stage twice. Neither of those productions has produced the sex scene, although I know productions that have. And so if you have seen a production of this where you get to see Angelo and Mariana together in the garden, I'm very interested to know how that was staged. Like, because I just, given the speech that comes right before it, I don't really understand how it could be. Also, apropos of nothing, I just mentioned they had sex in a garden, more religious imagery, gardens, Eden. They're in a city, so there isn't a lot of garden space, but, you know, we make some just for this specific instance. Okay, last thematic thing I want to talk about before we get into specific passages, or at least more specific passages, and that is that I want to talk about women and the sort of enclosedness of them. Measure for Measure has a quite diverse array of female characters. I hesitate to say that there are actually more female characters in this than in the typical Shakespearean play. I think it's in the top half, but we don't have an unusually large number of women, but we do have an unusually diverse array of women. They're all sort of filling different social roles, which is different than, say, Love's Labour is Lost, which has 5 women, but 4 of them are functionally identical. So we really only have 2 women represented across 5. In this one, all of the women are different, and for the most part, at the beginning, they are all enclosed. So Isabella and Francisca are in the convent. Mariana is in her moated grange, which she has had to retreat to now that she doesn't really have a social position, because she is engaged, but her fiance is never going to marry her. Then you've got Juliet, who is being put in prison, and Kate Keepdown, who does not actually appear on stage, but is referenced several times and is one of the happy couples at the end, because she's the one that Lucio has to marry. Kate is in a brothel. Mistress Overdone is also in a brothel, but it's the brothel that she controls. So she is the most liberated woman that we have here. And interestingly, except for Francisca, who is only in one scene, all of these women experience a reversal. Mariana and Isabella get married, if you accept that Isabella is getting married. Juliet is out of prison, but Mistress Overdone gets put into prison. I'll leave it up to you to decide whether this punishment of a female entrepreneur is descriptive or prescriptive on Shakespeare's part. Oh, since I teased it so much, I should talk about whether or not Isabella is actually marrying the Duke. So he proposes to her twice. The first one, so awkwardly. It's in the middle of his reveal that Claudio is, in fact, alive. He says, "If he be like your brother, for his sake he is pardoned, and for your lovely sake give me your hand and say you will be mine. He is my brother too." But fitter time for that. So it's sort of like he starts making this proposal and then he's like, actually, maybe not the best time, when she's just learned that her brother is still alive. So we'll talk about that later. And later happens to be about 100 lines later, when he says, "Dear Isabel, I have a motion much imports your good, whereto if you'll a willing ear incline, what's mine is yours, and what's yours is mine." Interestingly, the first time he sort of cuts himself off and says, actually, never mind, ignore that. And then the second time, he's making it clear that she has options in this thing. He says, "If you'll a willing ear incline," meaning not if you're even willing to listen to this. He's not even getting to the stage of "if you are willing to marry me." And interestingly, Isabella says nothing. So we don't know what she thinks about that. And I have seen productions where, after all the lines are said, she sort of pantomimes. I appreciate that, but I actually do just want to go and be a nun. So, bye. Good luck with running the city. The phone rang. And here's one thing that I was meaning to talk about when I was talking about the Duke, but I forgot, and that is reading the Duke as gay, which I think at this point in history it's too early for the historicist reading here, but by after Shakespeare had written this play and like later in his reign, we have reason to believe that James I had a boyfriend, so he's either gay or bisexual. So if the Duke is King James, it would make sense that he is also queer. The evidence we have here is, like I just mentioned, the incredible awkwardness of his proposal. He hasn't really seemed to be attracted to Isabella, and I think it's totally conceivable that she is just a beard who he likes. Beard is the term for a person you are in a relationship with in order to appear straight when you are not. There's also the line when Lucio is saying to the Duke in disguise about what a lech the Duke is, and the Duke says, "I never heard the absent Duke much detected for women. He was not inclined that way." And that could mean he was not inclined that way for, like, having extramarital sex with women, but it's also very easy to read that line as he's, not having sex with women. And this would also make sense for why the Duke has not been enforcing the laws for all of these years. A lot of the laws appear to be against fornication. Those are really the only ones that we hear about. Presumably there are some other ones. But, he's sort of been saying, I, in my glass house, am not going to throw stones at any of you who want to have sex with people that you're not married to, because, sometimes people you want to have sex with, you legally cannot get married to. So there's an interesting complication for that character. Okay, so at this point, I've talked about all of the big things. Now I'm just going to go through and read all my sticky notes and make sure that there wasn't anything else I wanted to say. Okay, so interestingly, when Isabella tells Francisca that she wants more restraint, this is an echo of Angelo's line when the Duke tells him that he's chosen him to be his deputy. He says, "Now, my good lord, let there be some more test of my metal before so noble and so great a figure be stamped upon it." I'm saying, I want more trials. And then that line at the end of his soliloquy that we focused on, "Nothing goes right, we would and we would not," is an echo of Isabella's line, which she speaks to him in Act 2, Scene 2, "For which I must not plead, but that I am at war twixt will and will not." Isabella, her legal and moral views are interesting, and something that I perhaps should have talked about more, but I haven't really gotten everything straight in my head yet, is the difference between what is legally correct and what is morally correct, and how that is presented in this play. Isabella, perhaps conveniently, all of her moral views align with the law, so it's important to note that she does think Claudio should die. She does think he has broken the law, which is bad because breaking the law is bad, and because fornication in itself is bad. So she thinks he should die, and he should not necessarily go to hell, but go to purgatory, which distinction is not really made strongly in this play. And then at the end, when Mariana asks her to get the Duke to pardon Angelo, because Mariana herself cannot do it, she says, "My brother had but justice in that he did the thing for which he died. For Angelo, his act did not o'ertake his bad intent, and must be buried but as an intent that perished by the way." So she actually does not think that Angelo has technically done anything wrong, because he attempted to sleep with Isabella against her will, but that actually didn't happen. He also attempted to kill Claudio, even though he promised that he would not, which he didn't actually do. A couple lines that I just think are great. Angelo's Act 2, Scene 2 soliloquy, after Isabella exits and he's realized that he is wildly attracted to her, he says, "From thee, even from thy virtue, what's this, what's this? Is this her fault or mine, the tempter or the tempted? Who sins most? Ha, not she, nor doth she tempt." I think that's a surprisingly modern expression. So he raises the question of whose fault is it that I am attracted to this woman, and then immediately answers it with, "Me, it's me, it me." Act 3, Scene 1, you have Isabella going to visit Claudio in the jail, which is so great. The best part of it, I think, is when Claudio describes what death will be like. He says, "Aye, but to die and go we know not where, to lie in cold obstruction and to rot, this sensible warm motion to become a kneaded clod, and the delighted spirit to bathe in fiery floods, or to reside in thrilling region of thick ribbed ice, to be imprisoned in the viewless winds and blown with restless violence round about the pendant world, or to be worse than worst of those that lawless and in certain thought imagine howling, 'tis too horrible, the weariest and most loathed worldly life that age, ache, penury, and imprisonment can lay on nature is a paradise to what we fear of death." Very Hamlet-y soliloquy. And I think that the part that comes before it is really human. It's one of those things that make the characters of this play seem more realistic than the characters of a typical Shakespearean play. Claudio at first wants to be very obliging to Isabella, and he's like, "Yes, I do not think you should do this thing against your will, to have sex with this guy. Yeah, I'm willing to die." And then he's like, "And what happens when you die? Oh God, I'm going to burn in hell. Literally anything is better than that. I do not care what anyone has to do. I just want that not to happen," which is a very human thing. Maybe that's just a very Libby thing. I really don't want to die, folks. You may have noticed that there's slightly more prose in this than the average Shakespearean play. That's part of a reflection of the city comedy. However, I think it's interesting that when we first see Mariana in her moated grange, she starts speaking in blank verse and then closes her opening speech with a couplet. "Let me excuse me, and believe me so, my mirth is much displeased, but pleased my woe." The couplet is elevating the speech and elevating the scene. So when we go to Mariana, we've sort of moved out of the city. It's not clear if she's living in like the suburbs or if she's just in like an enclosed house in the city, but we're sort of become separate from that. We also do get some couplets from the Duke in Act 4, Scene 2, but crucially, those are as an aside. The Duke tries to sort of lower his speech when he's in disguise. That's part of the disguise. So he says, "This is his pardon, purchased by such sin, for which the pardoner himself is in. Hence hath offence his quick celerity, when it is born in high authority. When vice makes mercy, mercy's so extended, that for false love is the offender friended." And then we'll close with some of the lines the Duke speaks in the final scene, which I just think are really great, and they're also self-condemnatory, which is a really interesting thing to wax poetic on. In his disguise, he says, "This made me a looker-on here in Vienna, where I have seen corruption boil and bubble till it o'errun the stew, laws for all faults, but faults so countenanced that the strong statutes stand like the forfeit in a barber's shop, as much in mock as mark." I love this play so much, guys. I hope that I have made you like it more than you did before. Really interested to hear other people's thoughts about it, and of course tell me about any productions that you've seen, especially that scene that Shakespeare did not write. Yeah. Look forward to doing King Lear next month. Another giant play. Why did I do this? Oh well.